buried memories in the dust. The air was the first thing to hit him. Not a smell but a weight, thick with damp earth and the phantom limb of the old pine mill. It was a scent he'd paid a fortune in therapy and cross-country miles to forget. A ghost that clung to the humidity, seeping into the wool of his suit, into his hair, under his skin. He tugged at his tie, a useless silk leash in a town that had long since slipped off the map. Anya's voice on the phone had been a thin wire stretched across a decade of grievances, but she'd used the one word that could reel him in. The one that cut through the clean, sterile detachment of his life. Finality. The workshop. His father's kingdom and his cage. He'd driven for 7 hours, the polished black of his German sedan a vulgar intrusion on the cracked asphalt of the county roads. Each mile had peeled back a layer of the man he'd built, leaving him raw and exposed. The town itself was a study in surrender. A handful of faded clapboard houses with sagging porches and storefronts blinded by plywood. At the end of the gravel drive, the workshop slumped like an old man giving up the fight. The red paint it once wore was now just a memory, scabbed and peeling to show the gray, weathered bone of the wood beneath. It wasn't a building, it was an accusation. To Liam, it was just the last messy item on a long list, a final asset to be liquidated before he could retreat to his spreadsheet-ordered world, where every variable was controlled. The old resentment, a familiar acid, churned in his gut. The sheer, infuriating inefficiency of it all, letting a place like this just rot. Out of pride. His father, Arthur, was a grandmaster of that particular art, a silent, immovable object who'd carved a chasm between them with his refusal to change. Liam had always seen it as a fatal flaw. Anya stood on the porch, arms crossed, a sentinel guarding the threshold to their fractured past. The lines around her eyes weren't from anger, but from a deep, settled weariness he knew, with a sharp twist of guilt, he had helped etch there. No hug. Of course not. The space between them crackled with unspoken things, missed birthdays, holidays acknowledged only by a check in the mail. He was the fixer, the pragmatic one, detached enough to handle the dirty work. Or so he told himself. He prided himself on his ability to compartmentalize. Then the wind shifted, and a scent snaked out of the open workshop door. Turpentine and linseed oil, sharp and absolute. It bypassed his brain, his carefully constructed defenses. A chemical key unlocking a room in his gut he'd bricked over years ago. The smell of his father. The smell of the trap. For one sickening, dizzying second, it felt like home. He squared his shoulders, a soldier marching into his own past to burn it to the ground. A fool's errand, he realized, even as he took the first step. The silence from inside was a living thing, a weight he was about to walk under. Armed with nothing but a briefcase and a loss so profound he'd mistaken it for impatience. Inside, the workshop wasn't a room so much as a lung, breathing dust. Sunlight, thick with swirling motes, cut through the grime in solid, hazy bars, illuminating tools on pegboards, their outlines softened by years of disuse. The air tasted of cedar and old grease, the sacramental incense of a life he'd judged and fled. Every surface was coated in a fine, pale powder, the accumulated history of sawdust and sweat. The only sound was the rhythmic rasp of sandpaper on wood, a hypnotic whisper that filled the vast space. Arthur was at the far bench, a silhouette against the bright rectangle of the open bay door. His back a stubborn curve. His hands moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm that was the only pulse in the world, a counterpoint to the frantic, shallow beat of Liam's own heart. He didn't turn. He didn't have to. Liam felt his own presence land like a stone in the quiet. The sound of the sanding drowned out the speech Liam had rehearsed in the car. The practiced jargon about market value, offers, logistics. He heard his own voice, then an alien in this space, talking about closing dates and escrow. And the words were meaningless against the workshop's breathing history. Arthur just kept sanding, his movements precise, unhurried. The silence wasn't empty, it was a wall built over 30 years. It was a dismissal more absolute than any shout, a quiet rejection that stung more than any argument. Anya, a ghost by the door, gestured with her chin toward a stack of cardboard boxes. The paperwork. The reason he was here. He tore into them, his frustration mounting with each brittle folder and puff of dust that stung his eyes. Old invoices, faded receipts, yellowed blueprints for projects he vaguely remembered. It was chaos, a perfect monument to his father's world. A world that lacked the streamlined precision Liam worshipped. Then his fingers, clumsy in this place of grit and memory, snagged on something hard. A small wooden box, tucked at the very bottom of the last carton, hidden beneath a decade of tax returns. The joints were perfect, dovetailed with a skill that was almost painful to look at. He lifted the lid, the wood smooth and warm. It wasn't full of papers. It was full of tiny, carved ghosts. A miniature race car, its wheels no bigger than a pencil eraser. The exact replica of the one he'd broken his arm in at age 7. A small, perfectly rendered dog with one floppy ear. The stray he'd cried over for a week when it vanished. And a boy. A small boy, no bigger than his thumb, holding a fishing rod, a tiny, almost imperceptible smile on his face. Him. Each one was a moment, a fragment of his childhood, carved with a tenderness he couldn't reconcile with the hard, silent man across the room. He picked up the little boy, his thumb tracing the smooth grain. It felt warm, as if it had just been held. On the bottom, burned into the wood with a pyrography pen, was a date. His 10th birthday. The day Arthur had closed the shop and taken him fishing on Miller's Pond. The last time he could remember them just being together, before the silence had become permanent. He looked from the carving to his father's broad, stooped back. The man he'd built in his head, the stubborn mechanic, the unfeeling craftsman, crumbled into dust. In his place was this other person, an artist who couldn't say the words, so he'd carved them instead, shaping his love with calloused hands. The clean columns of his spreadsheets, the rigid order of his life, they shattered, replaced by an aching, hollow space where a father he never knew had been living all along, speaking a language Liam had been too arrogant to hear. The sanding stopped. The quiet that fell was different now. It wasn't a wall. It was a vast, echoing chamber, heavy with 30 years of the wrong story. The little wooden boy in his palm weighed more than his briefcase, more than his car. It was an anchor, holding him fast to a truth he'd spent his life denying. He crossed the concrete floor, each step a confession, a shedding of the cynical armor he'd worn for so long. The corporate scripts were ash in his mouth. He stopped at the bench, the scarred, oil-stained wood, a map of his father's life, and placed the tiny figure down beside a chisel, a silent offering. Arthur stared at his own hands, calloused and stained, as if they belonged to someone else. Then slowly, his rough fingers reached out and traced the shape of the tiny fisherman. The touch was a prayer. When he finally looked up, the familiar, unyielding pride in his eyes was gone, replaced by a sorrow so deep it mirrored Liam's own. A shared grief for lost time. There were no speeches. The words wouldn't come. Liam pointed to the piece of wood on the bench, an intricate, unfinished joint. What is it? A stupid question. But it was the only one he had. Arthur's voice was gravel, a sound of disuse. He explained the design, a mortise and tenon for a rocking chair, its purpose both structural and beautiful. As he spoke, Liam didn't just hear the words. He heard the passion, the quiet fire he'd spent a lifetime dismissing as a waste. He saw the artistry, the sale, the liquidation, the very reason he was here. The idea now felt like a desecration. A new thought, fragile and strange, began to form. It wasn't a business plan. It was a lifeline. He started talking, the words clumsy, about websites, about a world that was starved for this, for something real, something made by hand. He wasn't taking over. He was asking to join, to learn. A light flickered in Arthur's eyes. Hope, tentative and fragile. By the door, Anya let out a breath she'd been holding for 20 years. A soft sigh of relief that rippled through the quiet room. The late afternoon light had turned to gold, bathing the workshop in a warm, forgiving glow. Liam took off his jacket, draping it over a sawhorse. His tailored pants were already dusted with wood shavings. He leaned over the bench, no longer a businessman but a son. Between him and his father lay a blank sheet of drafting paper, waiting. 2 sets of hands, one smooth and pale, the other scarred and strong, hovered over the same empty space, ready to begin. It was a new kind of quiet, one that didn't need to be filled. It was a start.